All of a sudden, it hits you. An idea. The one you've been waiting for, the big one. Characters you want to explore, a world that's filled with opportunity, and a plot that changes everything. You've got the idea for a series. The world that you want to spend the next 3, 4, 5 books in. The idea is there. Now, you just have to write it. Of course. I'll just write it. How do I do that? Planning a story, something standalone, is one thing. Planning a series takes a little more attention. Today, we're breaking into writing books, interviews, articles, and speaking to one author who's pushing the book series to its limit.
I've got this idea. I think it's insane. I want you to talk me out of it.
All right, here's the tough part. When it comes to art and anything that's like a creative process, explaining how to do it is really hard. I mean, art combines technique with purpose and expression, so most of the advice that you get is typically focused on one single aspect of that. The technique of painting a portrait covers brush direction and paint viscosity and dimension and light and shadow. Okay, well, I'm not a painter, so maybe I should stay in my place. Let's start small. Before we tackle the ins and outs of planning a series, let's zoom in on planning a single story. Unlike a scientific process, there's no sequential series of steps to writing a story. There's no recipe. There's just advice from other people about their own processes. And this is why writing advice always has this element of the abstract to it. It's so that you can take advice that other people offer and apply your own artistry to it. Now, that being said, let's look at all of these writing books that want to help you plan and write your own standalone story. This is a really good one. And this is just what I have here in the filming room. There's hundreds more writing books out there in the world, and I have another 10 or 15 on my Kindle. All of these books want to help you write a story. And some of these books focus on technique, like the actual words that you put down on the page. Some books focus on specific like components of your story, like characters or setting. And other books want to discuss the life and the purpose of a writer in more abstract terms. But all of that being said, there are a lot of books that want to help you plan a story. We have a lot of help. Well, not so much when it comes to planning a series, but we'll get to that. Planning a story comes down to a few components. You need a setting, characters, and a plot. And each of these elements has layers. And when it comes to planning a story out, you can crack into these books, or you can, search up all kinds of videos on YouTube, and you can find a method that really works for you. But what about planning a series? The first question that we need to ask is, how is planning a series different than planning a single story? Because they are different, right? All right, let's start with resources, right? Let's get all of the books for planning a story off of here, and we'll bring back any books that go over planning a series. Uh-oh. When it comes to taking a story from standalone to a series, there's much less content out there, but it shouldn't be that much different, right? When planning a single story, you have to present the reader with questions and provide them with answers, which might look like this. I've actually done a whole video on this topic already. The idea that your story arcs are questions asked at the beginning of the novel and answered by the end of the book, and all of the smaller arcs that happen along the way. A standalone story might look something like this. And if writing a series was just an extension of this, then we might get a story plotted out like this. Now, this could be a series, but it would be a series in the terms of like the Indiana Jones movies. Each movie is totally standalone, but it just happens to share some recurring themes and some recurring characters. Each is an adventure that an audience can join in on and never have to continue to that next part of the series. Will Indiana Jones find the Ark of the Covenant? Will he conquer the Temple of Doom? Will Indiana Jones find the Holy Grail. And this is a series of standalone stories. And there are plenty of series out there that are just like this and are incredibly fun to read. Each entry into this sort of series shows you more of the characters and shows you more of the world, but they just don't really have that much to do with each other. They're so much less intertwined, but they're a lot easier to plan. But I thought a series would be a lot more like this. Now, that looks a lot more complicated, but it also looks a lot more like what I've experienced with in some of my favorite series of all time. Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson, Malazan Book of the Fallen, the Gentleman Bastard series. All of these series are so addicting because there's always more questions being asked and more answers being given. You're constantly getting resolution to old details, and it pushes the whole story forward even more. But how in the world do you go about planning something like this? I'm gonna need some help. So I went to one author who is pushing the bounds of what a book series can be.
Hi, I'm Rob J. Hayes. I am a British fantasy and science fiction author. Ooh, at this point, I have 19 books published, but I don't know when this will sort of air or whatever. The God Eater books might already be out, at which point I'll have 22 books.
So how do you know if that idea that you had is big enough for a series?
But yeah, it's very much a, will the story branch out? Will it sort of grow and get bigger and the conflict move onto a larger scale? Or is it very much a, here's what my characters are going to do, this is their sort of their quest, and once they've finished it, that's it?
Okay, so this immediately unlocks something in my brain from The Story Grid by Sean Coyne. Let's go talk. One of the big takeaways from that book is that every component of a story, a scene, a sequence, an act, and the global story as a whole are composed of the same kind of things. It's this idea of story recursiveness. Your story as a whole has an inciting incident, a crisis, and a climax. But Coyne also says that each act has its own inciting incident, crisis, and climax. And a great story has those same elements within each scene. Rob says that a book worth expanding into a series has a plot that grows and expands and raises the stakes. Just like how Sean Coyne says that each act, with their own inciting incidences and climaxes, needs to grow in intensity. Maybe I'm looking at writing a series all wrong. This sort of standalone series, just like we mentioned here with the Indiana Jones style of adventures, is just that, a series of standalone stories all isolated. But this kind of series shouldn't be considered 3 stories. Maybe a better way to look at it is one big story with natural breakpoints. You aren't planning multiple stories as a series, you're planning one big story. And just like how a small standalone story is composed of these internal acts, so is your big story. Which means that planning a series maybe shouldn't be much more difficult than planning a standalone story, if you just look at it with a wider perspective. Then it's just another layer of that story recursiveness. That sounds like a lot of planning, but not every writer thrives in planning, outlining, or plotting a big story. That's like the whole idea of plotting versus pantsing. How does someone who likes to discover their story as they write approach writing a series that would be as connected as this? And I guess this is where your method of writing can differ from others. Rob, a self-identified pantser, likens his style of writing to driving down a road.
The sort of flashlight style of writing, whereas in if you think about it as in you're writing this book, you're on a car journey and you've got signposts that you know you're going to be passing along the way. You've got like landmarks, but you only see as far as your headlights shine. So you know sort of like what's in front of you and you know your destination, but you don't know what you're going to see along the way.
You'll find all kinds of advice about plotting and pantsing, and it's not really a hard and fast rule that you have to be one or the other. It's not like a black and white kind of thing. It's fair to say that the more complicated you want your series to be, the more questions you want to ask and the more answers you want to provide, then you might need to do more planning. But this doesn't mean that all of that information, all of that storytelling is done just in the first draft. Young writers can often forget that the first draft of a story can look very different than the final drafts. And that affects characters, it affects themes, and even these massive story arcs that you might want to achieve in your series. Remember, the first draft that you write for a story is just your first attempt at getting all of the ideas out of your head and onto the paper. It still needs a lot of refinement. Like when Rob wrote his progressive fantasy series Titan Hoppers, he had a lot of these big plot points in his head already.
Those sorts of things I always wanted to have in the story, so I wrote them in as I was going through. Um, the Most of the things that I added in afterwards were the smaller details, the sort of like, okay, so if I put in a little bit of foreshadowing here, then later on it's sort of like it pays off a lot more clearly. And I think that's most of the way that I write stories in general. I have an idea of where I want the overarching story to go. These are like the big plot points, and what I go back and add in afterwards are usually either little bits of world building, extra sort of like tidbits of lore that people might go, "Oh, that's really interesting," or those little bits of foreshadowing that will pay off either in the book or in later books in the series.
Those fine details are one of the things that makes a series of books so much more impactful than a standalone novel. And I mean, yeah, you spend a lot more time in the world and with the characters, but it's also the promise that the author makes to the reader that there will be long term payoffs if you read my series. And that's what a reader goes into a traditional series expecting. Rob's newest series, the God Eater Saga, that trilogy of trilogies that we mentioned earlier, takes this sort of planning and storytelling to another level. You see, late last year, Rob kickstarted a very ambitious project that was funded in just 10 minutes.
And yeah, it's set in a world where human beings can steal magic and immortality from angels by eating them.
You've heard me call it a trilogy of trilogies, but what does that mean? Well, it means that the God Eater Saga is composed of 3 different trilogies that are all connected in one long timeline. I'm assuming, I didn't write the thing. The latest series in the timeline begins with the book Herald, book 1 of the main series. 2,000 years prior to that one is the series beginning with the book Deathless. And 1,000 years prior to that one is sort of like the origin series to this immortal conflict, beginning with the book Demon. And when you have a timeline that spans over thousands of years and heroes and villains vying for immortality, then there are bound to be lies lost in time. And these books are being written and published in a very interesting way.
And I am writing it as a trilogy of trilogies being written and published concurrently. So I'm writing, well, I've written all 3 book 1s, and I'm currently writing all 3 book 2s, and then I will eventually write all 3 book 3s as well.
All right, next week, or July 9th for all you bozos late to the party, the first book of the main series comes out. Also, I've got to be honest, I am so damn excited for these books. I love this idea for the series and the way that Rob's putting out these books. I haven't seen it done like that before, which is why I was so excited when Rob responded that he would do an interview with me about planning a series. Go support Rob, he's a good guy. This style of storytelling gives Rob a really cool opportunity to tell the story of each series, which can be read in any order, but also to like plant seeds and lies and promises and betrayals and alliances that could affect the story thousands of years later. Remember this style of story arcs and how daunting it might look to plan a series? Well, Rob's Trilogy of Trilogies might look more like this. How did it come to this? And how do you go about writing something like that? So I asked Rob this, and I got an answer that I really wasn't expecting, and mostly because it completely changed the way that I plan and approach a story. I look at a story as sort of a collection of arcs and acts and questions and answers, and you've seen that in these drawings that I've done. But there's something extremely important that's missing here, and see if you can tell what it is.
I needed sort of twists that happen in the past that make you then look at something that happened in the future in a different way, and you go, oh, and then suddenly like it might click. Oh, there's these sort of like little Easter eggs that are hidden in the future that then just sort of make sense that you might gloss over before, but if you know that from the past, they then make you go, aha.
Did you hear it there?
I very much once the idea settled in my head, I very much wanted it to be able so the reader could read it in any order, and they'd still understand it. But depending on which order they read it in, they might have a slightly different experience of each book going into it.
There, the reader experience. You see, any story, whether it's a standalone or a series, is not an isolated story, which is always how I've approached it. You can't look at it in a vacuum. It's not just a collection of arcs and character and plot points and questions and answers, but it's how the reader experiences those things. It's not just the writing and the prose, but the intentional crafting of the story by the author to make sure that every detail and character and twist is presented in the way that best enhances the reader experience. Stephen King has this guiding principle that he talks about in his book on writing. He says that every book has an ideal reader, and he makes writing decisions based on what that ideal reader would most want to happen. Would that ideal reader be blown away by this betrayal at the end of the novel, or would they be disappointed? And this concept is sort of like Rob's approach to the God Eater saga. And talking more and more with Rob about writing this series, it became very clear to me that Rob always keeps in mind that reader experience with his stories.
There's certain things that I can just maybe I was going to be mentioning it in Herald or in one of the future books, which I can just omit from that and focus it more as a reveal in the past.
This is a prime example for how the reader experience can change how you would write that series. The story was planned one way, but the reader experience would be better if it went a different way. And I find that to be really eye-opening as to how authors can improve their craft. Planning a series is a very intentional thing. It takes deliberate setup and execution to bring the reader into the world that you create and to show them the story. If a reader is going to be invested in your multi-book story, then you need to be invested in providing them the best reader experience that you can. All right, so how do you go about planning a series? Here's my takeaways. First, a series is not a collection of multiple stories, usually. It's one big story. The different books in a series are the same kind of natural breakpoints in your story as an act is within a standalone novel. And thinking about it this way also means that all of those books on story can still work. They apply not only to standalone stories, but to larger works. Your story just has an extra layer of depth. Second, writing a series is not something that requires a strict outline. You can write a series as someone who enjoys discovering their story. It would be beneficial to know where to start and where to end and all the important bits along the way, but you can still allow yourself to explore using Rob's approach of this flashlight method of writing. Know where your signposts are and discover the path to the next one. Lastly, the reader experience is an element of storytelling that is just as important as your theme, your characters, or your plot. The more attention that you give to that reader experience, the more intentional you are about revealing twists and fan service and conflict. And if you've seen anything on this channel, you know that intentionality is like kind of my whole thing. I want you intentionally making choices for your story and knowing why you're doing this thing or not doing that thing. Be intentional. A big thank you to Rob Hayes for talking with me about this kind of stuff. This is my first go at making a video like this, so let me know if you liked it in the comments below. You can support Rob in his upcoming God Eater Saga with the links below. And if you like the book, post a rating and a review on Amazon and Goodreads. It goes a long way to helping out the authors you love. If you want to be part of our writing community, there's a Discord link below where you can join in on writing with us. Share your progress, participate in writing contests, even win some money with your writing. Subscribe for more stuff like this, and as always, thank you for watching.